There have been indeed spiritual communities all along in different parts of the world, particularly in the Buddhist tradition and among the Catholics in Europe, which are famous for their monasteries or the viharas after Buddha in India. In India itself, you will be surprised to know that we had no tradition of spiritual communities as such. They sprang up after the advent of Buddha. Till then, we had, of course, the tradition of small universities. The head of each university would be a spiritual leader, an enlightened man who had arrived at a certain higher consciousness, embodied it in himself, and communicated it to those who gathered around him. And he taught not only spiritual knowledge, but also other branches of life, what are today classified as secular knowledge. To the old Indian synthetic mind, life was one. There was no distinction between this worldly and otherworldly, between earth and heaven. Some of our oldest hymns in the Veda, they speak of earth as the mother, heaven as the father, and man, by man they mean the human species, as the son. They always saw one scheme, one movement of consciousness. And in the universities that sprang up, around each such spiritual leader, who was also the leader of the society, advisor to the king, but who never owned personal wealth, who never exercised temporal power. Nearly 64 arts were taught: economics, history, archery, cooking, science of horses, science of elephants, and all these according to the preference of the students. But they were not spiritual communities as such, designed to build missionaries of a particular faith. And these temples of learning, as they were called, were singularly free from the spirit of isolationism, rivalry, exclusivism that gradually came to characterize the old spiritual communities, whether in Europe or in Asia. We are not today speaking of those communities. Today, new communities, New Age communities are springing up everywhere, and I am concerned about their growth, the direction that they are going to take or they have to take. This was brought, the necessity of defining our position in this matter came very much home to me about 3 months ago, when I was invited to participate in a conference of 42 New Age communities in the northwest of this continent, in Salem, Oregon. The conference itself was organized about 60 miles from Salem, where there are hot springs. And there were about 600 people from different communities, all young people, small children, having diverse ways of dressing, diverse ways of functioning, but all seething with enthusiasm, which was something contagious. But none of them was definite about where these communities were going. Each community, the leader of each community, had his or her own idea, and there was no coordination. One did not know that the other existed. One did not know what the other was following. And this is a feature of many of the New Age communities all over the world. There are communities striving in their own way in the third world countries, of which little is known in this part of the world. And we hear that so many communities are dying in America. The moment the founder of a community dies, that community disintegrates or splits into a number of sub-communities. I have had certain concerns about this movement, and living as I do in one such community, which has been there for 50 years in India, and involved as I am in another fresh, young project of a planetary city called Aurobindo, the city of dawn, in about 7 miles from my place. I am very much enthused that similar experiments are being made in this country. But I deplore that very few have an idea what the communities are meant for. The New Age communities, the spiritual communities that are being formed, that are functioning, have all one aim broadly: to build a new age. They consist of people, mostly young, who are disillusioned with the existing patterns of living, existing structures, social and economic. And they have persuaded themselves to believe that most of the evils from which our present-day society suffers are due to technology. So there is a cry, go back to nature. Don't obey the laws of the establishment, as they call it. A kind of anarchism of mind. And a few people get together, they have a farm or they buy a farm, and they think the New Age community is forming. There are some who are motivated purely by economic reasons. They are dissatisfied, and rightly, with the existing system of production and distribution. concentration of wealth in the hands of a few. Even in this great country, rich country, like America, where there is a certain democratization of culture, a fair standard of living, which most people share, a high standard, I came across a study which pointed out that the real power, economic power in this country is concentrated in the hands of 13 families which have a large interest in oil, and they manipulate the politics and other spheres of life so as to suit them. I am not competent to pronounce how far this analysis is correct. But in my own country, where we are about 700 millions of people with untold hardship and poverty, where most of the people don't have 1 square meal a day, millions don't have a roof over their heads, most of the wealth of our country is concentrated in the hands of a few. This, in some way or other, is repeated in every country. Let us leave aside for the moment countries under communist ideology. Everywhere, this naturally is resented by the new generation that is coming up. They resent that so much is there and still the large majority of people are unable to share in that wealth. So they want to have an equal distribution of wealth. But the political system, political ideology does not permit it in many countries. There are other communities which start with certain religious fervor. Back to religion. In India, in the West, back to old forms, revival of the old rituals, the old dogmas, what we call fundamentalists. No offense is meant. Fundamentalists are there in every religion, in every country. They want to go back to the past in the pure form, unmitigated form. They also form communities. And there are those who want to break the social institutions like marriage, like family, and they want to have what is called a free society. But in what way do these communities really develop that consciousness which is necessary for the new age to come? We cannot have a new consciousness or a new age simply by rearrangement, restructuring of the existing society. By distribution, equal distribution of wealth, by one man, one vote in politics. Are we going to have a new consciousness? And if we don't have a new consciousness, in what way can we call, say, the 21st century the beginning of a new age as we all want to? My study of this question has led me to the conclusion that each person who wants to form or participate in a spiritual community or a new age community of this sort has first to commit himself to a spiritual change. All other changes are superficial and they lose their force after some time. I must recognize that my present nature, organized around the ego and the desire motive, my nature having its free movements of passions, desires, violence, aggression, that has got to change. And unless I change that in myself, I cannot be a force for a growth into a new mentality, a new society. So each person must first commit himself and accept a spiritual orientation in his personal life. I am very happy to report that when I made these points before this concourse of about 600 people, they did appreciate, they did recognize where they had to make up still, and they had further personal discussions with me. And this is the third time I have come to this country, some on this mission, and I do find a growing recognition of this need of a spiritual change in each one before a new age can be made possible. And the content of this new consciousness, for which we have to prepare ourselves, those of us who want to participate, not necessarily by going outside the society, but even living within the existing society, we can become centers, radiating centers of new consciousness. And that is, we must recognize that the demand of the time spirit today on each one of us is to move away from our moorings in the individual man towards the universal man. The horizons of our mind must be enlarged. The range of our emotions, of our heart, has to be widened. We must give up the habit of judging everything from our personal point of view. Anything that happens, the first reaction is we never judge a thing on its own merits. We always see how it affects us. The ego is the point of reference. That is a fairly primitive sign of manhood. We have to outgrow the old mentality, self-centered psychology, and move in a larger dimension, as if to emphasize this need, this necessity. We are seeing around us a systematic disintegration and breakdown of old ideas, old ideals, and institutions and traditions based upon those old ideas. They have served a purpose in the evolution of the society. But as man is preparing to take a march forward, those institutions which stand in the way, they are being knocked down, where men don't have the sense to change them. It took 2 violent world wars to break down many barriers. It would have been unthinkable, say about 50 years ago, 1910, to see or conceive of the possibility of 150 nations sitting together around a table as equals. The whole world had been divided into 4 or 5 blocks of colonial empires. And when the powers refused to see the signs of the times, nature struck through the holocausts of 2 world wars on a scale that has never been seen in history, and I hope will never repeat itself again. As I was saying, we have to move from the individual mold towards the mold of the universal man. Second, recognize that the age of institutionalized religions is over. In this connection, I would like to remind, or those of you who have not known this already, of what Dr. Buck, the author of the famous book Cosmic Consciousness, has said in his book. He was, as most of you may be aware, a Canadian doctor attending to mental patients, devising new methods of dealing with them. He was a disciple of Walt Whitman and had interest in many spiritual matters. He was an ardent student of Tennyson, of poetry of Tennyson, Wordsworth and so on, Blake. And one evening, somewhere in the last years of the last century, after a fruitful meeting with his friends, he was returning home in a hansom. There were no motor cars at that time. And when he was in the midst of a forest, it was midnight, he saw a huge conflagration. He thought that the forest had caught fire. He looked round, he stopped the cab, he looked round, and then he discovered, to his horror, that the conflagration was not outside but inside himself. And he says, in a moment, he had that flash, that mental illumination, that all life is one. And the crux of that life is love. And he is one with that. That completely changed the character of his life. And he went on to collect similar experiences that had taken place in the lives of individuals in history, past and contemporary. And he wrote the book Cosmic Consciousness, which was first published in 1902, 500 copies, which took a long, long time to sell. Today, of course, the book is running in its 29th edition. In that book, in his introduction, he makes 3 prophecies. He says, this coming century, that is, he wrote in 1898 or before 1900, this century will be remarkable for 3 revolutions. The first revolution will be due to aerial navigation, which will bring the whole globe, the whole world together in a way that has never happened in history. Second, it will be a sin to be rich. Poverty will no longer be there. Third, the existing institutionalized religions will cease to have any influence. They will be replaced by a universal religion in which there will be no intercessor between man and his creator. We are now nearing 1980, and I do believe we are seeing the working out of what he calls the 3 revolutions. We have outgrown the old mentality of considering people who do not practice our religion to be either heathens or infidels or inferior to us or those who are condemned. We no longer believe that we are in exclusive possession of truth. We have the sense to recognize that the reality, God, the divine being, the divine presence, has many aspects. It reveals itself in various forms. And my truth does not cancel your truth. All truths have a right to exist. We accept this at a certain level of the mind, but it has to be practiced, translated into life. A kind of universalism, a universal approach to things. And towards that end, the much abused United Nations has done great, commendable work. If the United Nations has failed, it has failed only in the realms of military affairs and politics. But in every other sphere, it has developed and promoted a global outlook, a global approach, a global mentality. Particularly to specialized agencies of the UNESCO in the fields of health, education, environmental problems, ecology, food, and various other, about 33 fields, it has brought to bear a world outlook. And one of the important constituents of new consciousness is this global mind. We can no longer think in terms of my nation and your nation. Nationalism is slowly getting out of date. What ego is to the individual, nationalism is to a nation. Just as the ego was a necessary point of individuation developed by nature in the evolving creature, at a collective level, nationalism was a motive implanted by nature for societies to develop a central feeling, a central way of life. But once having reached that stage, it becomes a disease. Nationalism is on its way out. We can no longer think in terms of America, Europe, Asia, but one world. I remember what a thrill I had around about 1940 when I had just passed out of the university. One of your leading statesmen, Wendell Willkie, he, I believe, contested the presidential election against Roosevelt, who I think was standing for the third term, a very unique phenomenon. And he went round the world as a candidate of the Republican Party. And when he toured round, he came back. He wrote a book of about 140 pages, if I remember right, entitled One World. That created, he was the first man to write a book like that, giving his impressions, giving his reactions, and his perception of the reality of one world. And his book created a sensation. So it was an American who first popularized in the present generation the concept of one world. Till then it was considered a dream of a poet. But today, after nearly 40 years, the time has come when each one of us has to consider himself as a citizen of the world. And this is one of the requirements in the place where I work and live, in the city of Aurobindo, where a general invitation has been given to people who believe that the old ways of life, old ways of society and economics are out of date, that they stand in the way of freedom of individual consciousness to grow and evolve. They are welcome there. provided they subscribe to 2 or 3 fundamental principles. 1. All wealth is commonwealth. I have no right to appropriate wealth to myself, make it my personal wealth. We go back to that ancient dictum of an Indian scripture, an Upanishad, where the very first verse says, all this is for habitation by the Lord. Do not steal what belongs to others. Renounce and enjoy. That is, make the best use of what you get, but know that it doesn't belong to you. It comes to you to be utilized, to be made the best use of, but you shall not have a personal feeling of ownership or proprietorship. In that spirit, Aurobindo has come into being, where the members do not earn private wealth. Second, they live as members of one world, humanity. They do not belong to this religion or that, this country or another, but belong to one world. They practice the ideal of human unity. And third, each one commits himself to the development of his consciousness, God-ward. An awakening to the divine presence in the heart of each one, a recognition of God in the universe around, and a willed opening of one's consciousness to the higher ranges of existence above the mind. An integrated, a total spiritualization of consciousness, which alone can give the necessary impetus to change one's mind, to change one's life habits, to change one's physical orientation towards building an ideal society, a perfect man in a perfect society. A new consciousness, a new age has got to move towards this ideal of equality. Sri Aurobindo, my teacher, he analyzes in his book, I believe, The Human Cycle, why the French Revolution failed. He says how the French Revolution gave liberty, but it destroyed equality. A small, powerful minority started tyrannizing over the majority, and that called forth for a counter-revolution. The Bolshevist revolution, he points out, failed because though it gave freedom, liberty, it destroyed freedom. There was a certain equality of status assured to everyone, but no freedom to think, no freedom to speak, no freedom to live as each one wants. And he says, both these terms, liberty and equality, can become real only when the third term is brought to life, fraternity, brotherhood. Once I accept and feel from within that you all are my brothers and sisters, I awake to the truth of brotherhood, fraternity. Both liberty and equality follow. And the new consciousness, the new communities have to develop this spirit of brotherhood. And brotherhood not only among those who constitute that community, but in the whole world at large. It is a disease that has ruined many spiritual communities when they begin to feel that they are exclusive, that they are superior, that they are the chosen people to lead the world. What I call the spirit of elitism that has been the bane and ruin of many spiritual movements. And number of spiritual new age movements which have sprung up and are functioning in this country are suffering from this disease. They look down upon other movements. They criticize other groups. They consider that what they do is the only right thing. Maybe for me it may be right what I do, but I cannot impose my right, my way on another. I should have the largeness of mind, that integrity of character, to recognize that each one has his way, and each ideology, each approach, each formation has its own reason for existence. This mutual recognition, a kind of acceptance of the bona fides of each other, has to be the first condition for the growth of the New Age movement, New Age community movement, wherever in this world. I personally, as I said, have grown in such a community, and I know where exactly and at what point this spirit of elitism creeps in and vitiates the atmosphere. There may be inequalities from the point of view of wealth, from the point of view of political power, but in the realm of spiritual consciousness, there has to be only equality. All souls are equal. Natures may be different, but the soul, presiding and dominating and ruling nature, they are all equal. They are all equal portions of God. This acceptance of the omnipresence of the divine reality, that all of us are basically equal, essentially the same, that has to govern the minds of those who want to form and run these communities. Next, concentration of power. Each community automatically starts as a movement, but then develops into an organization. An organization calls forth a kind of hierarchy of power. This has to be avoided by a rotational system. Nobody should occupy one position for too long a time. Even in spiritual matters, there spring up vested interests. There has to be a kind of continuous movement. Each one must occupy every position at some time or other, so that each one knows the problems, the difficulties of different functionings. An attempt towards this end has been tried with certain success in that community called Findhorn in Scotland. Many of you may be familiar with the institution of Findhorn, where the accent is on the plant world, becoming aware of a consciousness in the plants, praying to the spirits of the plant world, evoking their response, God's grace through that, and having a flourishing vegetable and plant kingdom. And there they have this system of rotation, of focalizers, as they call. Whenever there are community problems, they have small groups who start with the assumption that nobody can be always right. Even if I am right, I have no business to enforce my right till I convince others and bring them round. This is what is called a principle of consensus, which is being tried in Aurobindo, in that planetary city of which I spoke. There we have no boss, we have no head, a president or a chairman or a vice president who will lay down the law and everybody will follow. No. These 500 people who are there, spread over an area of 2,000 acres to begin with, they are learning to govern themselves by the process of consensus. They meet together, those people concerned, chosen representatives, and these representatives change, and they discuss the priorities, the needs, and come to some workable solutions. We recognize that at some stage in human evolution, there will be no governments of the type we have today. The state is going to wither. Men will be so enlightened that they will not need a policeman to keep them on good behavior. They will not need external laws to be imposed on them. There is an inner law. There is an inner imperative. And to develop that consciousness, which becomes aware of that imperative from within and follows on that, which can never conflict with the imperatives of others. That's the direction towards which this world is moving, and it is incumbent on each spiritual community that wants to serve the cause of new consciousness to start practicing these principles in the individual lives of the members. I have done, and I would invite questions.
There's enough agreement with what you've been saying with these ideas, that there's enough agreement that we can turn the world around as far as pollution and the problems that we have.
Agreement on principle, but how to work it out? There is no agreement there. Yes.
You mentioned the spiritual community of Findhorn and also put your finger on a problem which very much concerns me. Findhorn was, of course, created by individuals,
Yes.
Peter Blatty and others, who, for a time, Peter Blatty was looked upon as a sort of guru, although he's a very, very charming, very relaxed man. How can we get this merging of, as you say, a consensus, a sort of democratic spirituality, and also not have this spiritual elitism where you have the central figure who usually starts such a community. There are communities in this country, for example, where there is a central figure and people working harmoniously together and working with the communities in which they find themselves. I wonder if you could sort of address that problem, how we separate ourselves from the ego of the principal person.
This is a constant feature in every community that is initiated by one charismatic figure, whether in Findhorn or Lindisfarne or Arcosanti in Arizona or in our place in Pondicherry in India. A great person, a person who has some revelation, some vision, philosophy, works out things in his own personal life, and people gather around, they start working it out. And things go around that person. Now, if that person is enlightened and he is above his ego, he does not believe that his solution is the only possible solution to the problems of the world. But he is humble enough, he has humility enough to recognize that his is one brick towards the edifice that is rising. One solution. Well, what he does or she does is to prepare the community by a progressive decentralization of power, decentralization of functions, so that before the person passes away, things are already moving on a certain democratic shared level. And my information is that in Findhorn, they have recognized that the caddy rule cannot continue any longer. The both of them have become old, and I believe Peter Caddy himself has shifted his focus elsewhere. I met him in Ashland 2 months ago, and he told me that he was trying to develop a community in Hawaii. And Ellen Caddy, she has been trying now to have a kind of a group leadership, 5 or 6 people, to lead, to share, and to teach others. But some of the young Americans who were there, very promising, I believe David Spangler is one of them, they got out immediately from there when they saw that they were being groomed for leadership. They said, this is not the way for new community. A new community should function without a leader in the old sense. Simply because I know certain techniques more, or I have the capacity to organize things, I should not arrogate to myself leadership of a community. Hereafter, the concept of leadership will have to undergo a great change. Not knowledge, not authority, not power, but love. My capacity to love, extend myself, and that love expresses itself in service, in working, selfless work. They will be the real leaders. And they will not occupy top positions, but they will be the humblest people. So, in Findhorn, I am told, they are recognizing the contradictions. You can't have hereafter a hero figure. But you can't have either a chosen leadership who are to be foisted on others. But everybody must be given a sense of participation. Each one must be encouraged, built up into a responsible member. That is a part of the discipline, and that is what we are trying to do in Aurobindo. How far we will succeed, we do not know. But every step taken is a step gained for humanity. But the concept of leadership has to change.
Isn't it possible to form a community within the structure of society as we have it set up now without going outside?
It is, and that is, I think, the right way to do. I was very agreeably surprised at the beginning of my current tour when I was in Boulder, in Colorado. There, for instance, I was invited specially to speak to a group. It is called World Family. They are integral parts of the society. 20 miles away from Boulder, they have 4 or 5 families. They have these new ideas, ideals of new change of man, participation in the world movement and all that. The teachers, farmers, people of that type, they don't have much money, but they have constituted themselves into what is called a unit. They don't live in the same house, but they live in an environment where each is accessible to the other. So one family, it collects the produce from the farmers. Next, somebody transports it to somewhere else. Another family markets it. In between for the families, children are there. The wives teach, they have a small school. So within the society, right from the farmer to the bolder supermarkets, there is a chain. Each link being forged by each family, believing in those ideals, practicing a certain equality, practicing certain honesty and integrity, and they function as a kind of a live, spiritually oriented community, participating in educational and commercial and financial affairs of the society around. And they have made a mark. Their faces are singularly free from all kinds of tension. Bright, no jealousy, no rivalry, each one helping the other, but all without any spiritual ego. I do think we have to have pockets of such New Age consciousness, New Age spirit everywhere. And these pockets of integrity, pockets of new consciousness, wherever they automatically become related at some time or other. These are what are called islands of light, which will one day, merge more and more and flood the whole world with their light.
You're not arguing then as a leader, against the concept per se of a leader. It's simply the type of leader that you're advocating would be one who is without the spiritual ego, but a leader who teaches or directs is still necessary. I feel like you would agree to that.
I would say the content of leadership, of my conception, is not authority, but service. In effect, I lead people. People come, I guide them, but I don't exercise any conscious authority over their thoughts or feelings. I try to convince them, I try to draw them towards my way of thinking, because I feel I have something to contribute to that person's development. So, from one point of view, you may say it is a leadership, but the content is different.
The concept of the infallibility or of the ego.
Yes.
Because
Of course, that has been the bane. Every leader thinks he is indispensable and he has all the wisdom, and that is where the leadership is a suicidal leadership. A spiritual leadership always means I first recognize that I may be wrong, I can be wrong, the other person may be right. Nobody is infallible. Even God, if he starts working in these worldly affairs here, our complex Iran-American relations, I am not sure whether he will do the right thing. These are experiments. These are experiments in a new direction. We have to experiment, we have to learn, and what suits some humanity in one section of the globe may not suit humanity in an advanced part like here. So nothing can be generalized in these matters. There can't be uniformity. That is regimentation. There has to be democratization, decentralization, and humility. Thank you.